The first half of the 5th century was the time of glory of the famous Roman general Aetius, who went down in history as the last Roman. This sad title he shared with his political opponents. As we remember, the Emperor Theodosius the Great was considered a friend of the Gothic people, because he made an alliance and peace with the Goths, and his daughter, Galla Placidia, married the king of the Visigoths, Ataulf. One of the writers of the time, who had no illusions about the prospect of strong ties with the barbarians, called this marriage a union of clay and iron. Indeed, the marriage of Galla Placidia was not quite a successful attempt to combine two completely different worlds. A year later, everything collapsed. The son born Placidia died, King Ataulf killed, and the fate of his widow became uncertain. A series of palace coups in the Visigoths ended with the accession of King Vallia, who was elected by the violent Germans in order to quarrel with the Romans. The nationalist, anti-Roman party triumphed. Vallia considered it best to get rid of the widow Ataulf as soon as possible and sent her to Ravenna, to her brother, Emperor Honorius. At that time Honorius was distributing Roman lands to the barbarians, de jure consolidating what de facto had already been accomplished. First, he recognized the Burgundians' right to own the southeastern part of Gaul. Then it was the turn of Aquitaine with the cities of Toulouse and Bordeaux. At the same time Honorius tried to look pleased. He seemed satisfied with the state of affairs. He declared himself consul for the 11th time, and his co-emperor appointed Flavius Constantius. In the described epic acted several outstanding generals, but all of them overshadowed Aetius. Actually, in the rays of glory of this man, marked not only by contemporaries, but also by historians, writers of later epics and even cinematography, such expressive figures as Costini, Constantius, Boniface are lost. The last Roman, such remained in the centuries of the reputation of this great opponent of Attila. Constantius began military service under Theodosius, and after the death of the most influential man of that time, Commander Stilichen, advanced to one of the first places at the imperial court in Ravenna. He fought in Africa, where the next Christian heresy, Donatists, raised a real revolt against the central government, then became master of the militia, commander-in-chief, received the title of consul, a title to nothing substantial in those years, no longer obliged, but very honorable. This is the man, having made him consul for the second time, Honorius, and offered as a husband to his sister Placidia. Some writers say that at first Placidia opposed the new marriage, but then resigned, because she discovered the opportunity to have a great moral influence on her husband, a brave soldier, but a short-sighted Saravorza. She trained him in ambition, and got her brother to declare Constantius his co-emperor with the title of Augustus. The real picture was probably much more complicated than such a simple and convenient scheme. Smart, bossy, cunning Placidia, and at her honest, brave, but not very far-sighted soldier. However, it cannot be said that this scheme is completely devoid of grounds. For a short time of her second marriage Placidia gave birth to 2 children, a daughter Honorius and a son Valentinian, who would later become Emperor Valentinian III. At that time between Honorius and Placidia, established a very close, affectionate relationship, which gave rise to ambiguous talk. Confirmation, however, these rumors were not found. Honorius was a ruler weak and easily influenced by someone else's stronger will, so the real power was concentrated in the hands of Placidia. The new Augustus Constantius Byzantine court did not accept, and Constantius himself as if really weighed court life with its etiquette and inevitable intrigues and longed for a free soldier's life in tents and campaigns. Anyway, in the 7th month of this reign, Constantius became suspiciously ill and died. And this is where the relationship between Placidia and her brother broke down. They began to quarrel, and their personal guards reached bloody clashes. It must be assumed that Placidia's entourage had long been looking for a reason to exchange arms with the Roman guards, because the personal guard of the former Visigothic queen consisted of barbarians. Intrigues grew and, eventually, reached Africa, where almost unlimited power had another prominent commander of that era, Boniface. He constantly supported Placidia and sent her money in difficult times. Now it is time to ask the question: who was Boniface, and how come he reached such a high position in Africa, the richest Roman province, probably the most desirable for any invader? After all, he who owned Africa, he owned the Roman bread. Boniface, as well as his political opponent Aetius, historians call the last Roman. So how did this valiant husband find himself in Africa? The chronicler Prosper Aquitansky attributes the beginning of the African epic of Boniface to the wrongful actions of Flavius Costini, also a famous and glorious commander. Even less is known about Costini than about Boniface. He occupied a high position of the commander of the imperial guard, then acted against the Franks in Gaul, and from there, already in the position of commander of the army, moved to Spain, intending to evoke the province of Baetica from under the power of the Vandals. After several successful battles, Costini betrayed his Gothic allies, and the Vandals immediately took advantage of this and defeated the Roman. Baetica remained vandalized. Moreover, it became so firmly entrenched with the Vandals that it was renamed Vandalusia. Later this name was transformed into Andalusia. Another factor that led to Costini's defeat was Boniface's rather dubious behavior. The fact is that by that time he was already a famous commander. Boniface, perhaps not unreasonably, thought that his merits were enough for him to be given command of the army, but instead he found himself under Costini. In the end, Boniface refused to submit to Costini, finding it dangerous to himself and unworthy to follow him. Knowing from experience that he was unfriendly and prideful, he rushed to port and thence to Africa. And so in Africa the power of Boniface grew so great that he became the ruler of that province. It should be noted, however, that there are no specific reports on how exactly Boniface came to rule over North Africa. He is mentioned as the man who ruled over Africa, and none of his contemporaries gives his title. At first he was only a de facto, but not an official ruler. It is absolutely certain that local large landowners were interested in Boniface and his army, who needed protection from raids of Berber tribes. Boniface kept his end of the bargain honestly. He drove many barbarian tribes out of Africa. However, Boniface's military units themselves also consisted mostly of barbarians, and their rampages were complained about. Meanwhile, in the empire occurred at once two important events. First, Galla Placidia finally quarreled with her brother emperor, took her children and went with them to Constantinople. And in the middle of August of the same year Emperor Honorius died in Ravenna from dropsy. The second event logically followed from the first. In Ravenna began turmoil, and one of the court officials named John, having secured the support of the military, proclaimed himself the new emperor. In Constantinople John was not recognized, and the legitimate successor to childless Honorius called Placidia's son Valentinian. That was still quite a child, so that the power passed into the hands of his mother. And this is where the last Romans divided. Flavius Castinus, who was commander-in-chief, supported John. He appointed Costini as consul. Naturally, Constantinople did not recognize this appointment. Boniface from Africa sent Placidia funds, and the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire Theodosius II sent to Italy his army to destroy the usurper. This army was led by 3 generals. The army went to Dalmatia and there divided. The infantry was put on ships and moved to Aquileia, the main port north of Ravenna. Aspar, who remained with the cavalry, marched along the coast. Ardaburius was unlucky. His ships were caught in a storm and carried south, where they fell in with John, and the usurper captured them. Candidian, however, reached Aquileia and took it. Aspar soon arrived there also. John realized that he would not have enough strength to deal with such an enemy. Therefore he put all his hopes on negotiations, and Ardaburius was his main trump card. The latter was held as an honorary prisoner. However, Ardaburius did not appreciate the kindness shown to him and took advantage of his relative freedom to encourage the garrison of Ravenna to treason. Ravenna was considered impregnable. A vast expanse of impassable marshes surrounded it, far more secure than the highest fortress walls. But Aspar, who was on his way to rescue his father, managed to find a guide, and he led the troops safely through the mire. This passage is presented by the church historian Socrates as a miracle, and in the guide he recognizes an angel sent from heaven. When Ravenna was not expected to be attacked, Aspar's army suddenly found itself right under its walls. The city fell without a fight, perhaps because of the treachery prepared by Ardaburius. John now found himself in the role of a prisoner. The miracles that led to the throne of Valentinian III continued. Placidia and her son, who had traveled by sea to Aquileia, were barely saved in a storm. In honor of the miraculous rescue, she later built a church. In Aquileia was sent an hapless usurper John, where he was subjected to public execution. First exposed to shame in the circus, cut off his right hand, carried on a donkey, and only then executed. And what about the most important of the last Romans, Aetius? Aetius supported John. When Constantinople sent an army, or, more precisely, 3 armies, against the usurper, Aetius immediately left for help to his old allies and personal friends, the Huns. They allocated troops to Aetius, but he was late and arrived with the Hunnish army in Ravenna on the 3rd day after the execution of John. Perhaps without knowing what had happened, Aetius attacked Aspar and in a bloody battle managed to defeat him. Was this victory useless, since John was already dead and there was no point in fighting for him? However, Aetius fought not only for John, but also for himself. He began to negotiate with the new power, from a position of strength. Given the title of Comite and the post of commander-in-chief in Gaul, Aetius agreed to persuade his Huns to leave Italy. Generously gifted, the Huns finally returned back to their nomadic lands, and the Roman government breathed a sigh of relief. So the young Valentinian III was clothed in imperial purple. The most powerful people under him were still his mother Galla Placidia and 2 rival generals, the last Romans, Aetius and Boniface. The struggle between them was just beginning.